Hi, I'm Gina and welcome back to my channel and welcome to my newly redesigned craft space. It's still a work in progress. We've got some shelves to go up. I'm just waiting for some brackets to come through. But it's actually allowed me to have my storage spaces, which would normally have been on the back wall, and I've moved those to the side walls, and it's given me some dedicated space where I can actually display my projects and have them situated in a way where they're easily accessed and I can be able to display them as well. So I'm really excited to get this project finished and get it all underway. But yeah, so my channel. So I decided to create this channel basically because I spent a lot of time looking at other YouTubers that were creating miniatures and doing DIY and all sorts of other things. So I'm actually dedicating this channel to more miniatures. So if you're looking for anywhere that you can get some inspiration, copy my ideas, copy the way that I do things, maybe you can give me some ideas, would be really, really cool. So creating getting into the community of miniatures. And so yeah, so this is a channel, this is the place to come, and I'm based in New Zealand, and a lot of the time a lot of the YouTube channels are based in America, and a lot of the craft places where they're sourcing materials we just don't have here. So I'm using New Zealand based products that you can only get here. Some things I have sourced from overseas, but for the most part it's all based in New Zealand. So yeah, so let's get started on this particular video. So this is the Addams family project. It is very much still a work in progress, and it is all made out of foam board and mat board. So yeah, I've got another video that sort of is a little bit of a tour, which I can link down below, but it's just really a very high level overview of, you know, we've got some, you know, working windows. When they actually work, that's a bit embarrassing, isn't it? So working windows, we've got shutters that open, all sorts of things. So check that out. I'll put the link in the description below. But for today's video, we're actually just going to be concentrating on this little guy up the top here. So this is the attic of the Addams family. And the reason why I wanted to do this was to test a few techniques out before I kind of went a lot larger on the project, and mainly around these shingles. So what I've actually done is I've used quite wide popsicle sticks, but I was worried that they might have been a bit too thick, because I think that generally shingles on a doll's house is they're actually quite thin. But they were really expensive and I'd had to buy them from overseas. So again, just trying to source some local material and not having to spend a small fortune on them. So there's a lot of roof space still to cover. So they've got all of this space here, all over here and around the side, and then there's an equal roof space here. It's going to look a little bit different, but it's basically the same sized roof, so there's still lots to go. So before I launched into that, I thought this would be a really good opportunity to sort of test out a few techniques on how to create it. So we're going to be going through that. Also, we're going to be going through creating some shutters, and I can talk to you a little bit about that. But yeah, so it's going to be quite an exciting, quite an exciting video. So yeah, let's get started on it. So to begin with, I've created these walls and the floor of the attic off camera. It is also the roof line that sort of juts out a little bit over the tower. And to make all of the shingles, what I'm going to do here is I'm just measuring these out. They're 18 millimeters across by, they're about 2 millimeters thick, so they're probably a little bit thick. And I've just measured down right about 40 millimeters, which is the length of the shingle. And I've created a basically a template that I've just gone through and marked them. I'm not going to go through and cut all of the popsicle sticks, so don't freak out. It is quite monotonous and rather time consuming. But as you can see there, I'm just using my easy cutter, which is really awesome. Doesn't cut all the way through though, just being a little bit thicker in the stick. And just quite wide, but as long as I can kind of press it down reasonably hard, it will actually break off reasonably easy, and that's what I've done with most of the other ones. So I'm just sort of showing you the process that I go through with these, and yeah, so we're just going to put those middle bits aside. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm just going to measure up the depth of the shingle, and I'm just very much aware that these have got a rounded bottom, and while that might not be too much of an issue, if I sort of don't get them square on right from the beginning and line them up next to each other, they're either going to go down on a really slanted angle, or they're going to have sort of jagged edges along as they're not sort of lined up. So I thought the easiest way to do this would be just to mark a line as a guide, and I'm just using that off the first round or row around. I do go through and mark each one, but we're not going to be able to see that because it's just quite time consuming and monotonous. But I just wanted to kind of just sort of point out there's a really good reason for doing this, and it just sort of helps with just keeping everything lined up. Okay, so before we kind of get into doing all the shingle work, what I've done is, before I created the foam board, walls and floor, I actually copied all of those onto some mat boards so that I could create some templates. And then what I'm doing here is just basically dry fitting everything. I dry fit everything to the nth degree, and as you can see, all those little white pieces of mat board, they're just the shavings that I've cut off just to make sure that they fit really well. And here's an example of one where I've just cut it to size, fitted it in, and then basically just cutting it back down to size so that I know that it's going to have a really good fit. And then we can see it there. So I've just fitted all 3 walls, the roof, and then I'm just doing the flooring as well. So just cutting out the little bit there for the doorway, just to make sure that there's no gap there, and then we've also got the roof area as well. So before we can start the shingle work, what we need to do is actually glue in this mat board, because it's about 1 millimeter thick, which is going to push up the height of all of the shingles, and otherwise I'd literally have to cut round all of the shingles to fit this particular piece of board in, which helps with the roof structure. Hi, welcome back. In this next piece, I'm just going to go through a little bit of a montage just to try and speed up the process, because as you can see, there's lots and lots of layers of these shingles, and it's a bit boring, it's a bit monotonous, it's just sort of the same process over and over again, but the reason why we draw the lines onto the project was to make sure that we get them all lined up straight. With having a round bottom on the shingles, you can quite easily tilt it either way, and before you know it, your lines are sort of going down on an angle. So that's the reason why we drew all the lines, but it is, like I say, it's a little bit monotonous, so cue the montage. Hi, welcome back. So in this next piece we're going to be talking through, or I'm going to be showing you through how to create the interior woodwork of the attic. So it's kind of broken out into a couple of parts. One is around creating the texture on the mat board, and then also creating the paint effect to give it some wood texture, just using different browns and blacks and whites as well. So that's really cool, and then we're going to stick it all together before we move on to the next part. So hope you enjoy. So here you can see that I have cut out all of the mat board, and what I'm doing here is just marking up all of the wooden slats. So I'm just doing them 1 centimetre apart, and I'm just drawing them all out with pencil first. And then what I'm doing here is basically cutting with my craft knife, X-Acto blade, is to cut either side of that pencil line. So we're cutting 2 lines just through that top layer of mat board, either side of that line, and then what we're going to do is we're going to come back and lift that first layer of mat board off. And what this does is it actually creates a bit of texture in as if it's got wooden planks across each of those walls. So we're going to do all 3 walls, the ceiling and the floor. And then to create the individual boards, so for this particular thing with the attic, I was thinking it's probably going to be quite random. So all I do is go through with my X-Acto blade and cut some random vertical lines, and then just go through with a sharp tool just to push in those lines. Now, because we've cut through that first layer of mat board, I'm just going through with a layer of Mod Podge just to try and strengthen it all up again. And then here we're going to get into the painting. So the first off, I'm just going to do a coat of brown. This is a mixture of 2 different browns that I have. One is quite a red base and one's quite sort of a grey base. So it's good, giving it a good coverage, and I go through and do that on all of the areas. And then I've just mixed in a bit of white with that brown paint just to lighten it up a bit, because I felt that it was quite dark. So I just go through all of that. And then just to highlight some of the areas, as if this is an attic, so it's probably had some moisture in there, there's probably been some water get in, and there's probably been like some mold that has got on there. So just with the black, I've just kind of very lightly kind of dusted it over with the black, and then with here I'm actually going over with the white to pick up all of the different boards. So just trying to get on all of the different edges, both vertical and horizontal, just to try and highlight those. And as you can see, that's starting to come together really nicely. So now we're just going to stick it all together and put all the walls and the ceilings in, and to do that we're going to do another little montage. Welcome back. We're into the last stretch before we finish up the project, and this part is actually creating the shutters. And the shutters are basically just they're going to be glued onto the outside of the project. It's right at the top, so they don't need to open, and it just means that I don't need to create the back part of the shutter, whereas normally if it was open I would be creating a frame on both sides, but for this particular one I'm just going to create it on one side. Paint it all up, and then we're going to stick it all together, and then that's going to be the end of the project. So yeah, hopefully enjoy. So to begin with, I am using the cutout from the interior walls, just rather than throwing away a bit of scrap. This is actually going to be the exact size that we need for the shutters. What I'm doing here is going to measure in 5mm around the entire edge, as well as finding the middle, and then also creating 5mm either side of the middle. So that will give me the frame of each shutter. I'm not going to cut them in half at this stage or cut them in two at this stage. I'm just going to keep them together. They're not that big, and it's just easier to keep them in one piece as I work through them. So here I'm just going through and marking out all of the frame. I'm doing 10 mils at the bottom, so just a bit bigger, just to kind of add a little bit more weight and structure to it. And so to do around the curve, all I'm doing there is just marking in ever so often 5 mil, and then I'm just going to freehand it round on an arc. When you're trying to draw an arc, it's easier to draw it with your wrist as if it was in the middle of the circle. So as you can see there, I'm right-handed, so it's easier for me to draw it as I'm sort of sweeping around, as if I'm sweeping around an arc with my wrist on the table. So it just gives me a pivot point as I'm drawing around. Here I'm just cutting out each one of the center part of the frame, just to give me that frame look, which is good. And then which just takes just a little bit of time to cut out, just a little bit of time to cut it out. And then just making sure we get round the arc of the top of the shutter as well. So here I'm using it's what we call cardboard, but I know that I've heard some people use the word chipboard. Chipboard for me in New Zealand means something quite different, but this is basically just cardboard. It's just a Weet-Bix packet or a cereal packet, and all I'm doing is just cutting out the shape of the frame. Now this is where it gets really, really tedious. So this is where we're starting to create the shutters. What I'm doing here is just measuring in about 1 millimeter each side of the frame. And this is really just to give me a guide of how far over to make the shutters. And what we're trying to do here is create a little eye shape in the way that the shutters are created. It'll make a little bit more sense. So what I'm doing here is marking them up. I'm going to create a larger version so it's a little bit easier to see, because this is so tiny and it's just really hard to see. So what I'm doing is measuring 3 millimeters apart for each shutter. So they're quite small, and there are a number of them. So I've gone up both sides, and then I've gone up, now all I'm doing is just drawing them out. So between those two lines that I'd marked up about 1 millimeter in from each of the frame, I'm just marking through those 3 millimeter lines, 3 millimeter gaps between each line to those lines that I have marked, which gives me the sort of the outer edge of the shutter. So yeah, so by creating this shape, and it just means that we're not having to create individual shutters and try and glue them into place. So we're using the strength of the cardboard to actually help with this. So here I'm just drawing up a larger version just to give you a much better idea. So here you can see we're drawing some eye shapes. And all we do is we cut through the eye shape and leaving a gap between each one of those end pieces, and then cutting through where the shutters are, and then using the strength of the cardboard, where you can see that we can actually tilt them without having to create individual pieces. So here is just going through and cutting each individual piece. I'm actually just going to freehand this. It's just, the cardboard itself is actually quite thin, and as long as you've got a sharp blade, it's a reasonably easy process. It's just quite time consuming because there are so many small cuts to make. So I'll just go through and cut all of the vertical, all the horizontal lines, I should say, which is creating all of the individual blades for the shutters. And then I'll go back through and create like the little side pieces, which are really, really minimal. So they're basically, because the shutters are 3 mm apart, all I need to do is make sure that there's at least a millimetre gap in between each one of those lines. So each one of these lines is only 2 mm long, and then with a millimetre in between. And here's our resident explorer, Mrs. Loki. He's always very up to a lot of mischief most of the time. So yeah, so this just took a little bit of time and a little bit of patience because it is just repetitive, but we get there in the end. So once we get right down to the end, we're going to grab some sandpaper. As you can see, the back of it is still the Weet-Bix packet or the cereal box packet, and it's got kind of a waxy surface on it. So I'm just going to sandpaper it up just to scratch up the surface, just so that when I'm looking to do the paint, the paint will stick to it. I also grabbed a set of tweezers, so they've just got a little angle on the end of it, and we're just using some normal craft glue to actually glue the two pieces together. So the frame and the shutters, you can see a piece is broken away there, which I'm actually not worried about because we want these to kind of look a little bit old and abandoned and a bit run down. And so all we're doing here, as you can see on that larger piece that I did, we're just putting the tweezers in between and just sort of bending them up. At this stage I'm really not too worried if they break. Like I say, we've lost one at the bottom there. And then just kind of creating the texture of the shutters, just to kind of go through each one of these. So I go through both sides and just work my way through. Just again, this is just time consuming. It takes a little bit of time, bit of patience to kind of work your way through, which is all good. But they do come out really well, and even if some of the ends come off, that's fine. I actually go through and sort of tweak them up a little bit more as well. Yeah, so there's another bit that's just come off, which is absolutely fine. Like, I wouldn't worry too much. And then I've just gone through the other side there. And then what I'm doing here is just gluing the two pieces together. So we're gluing the frame now to the shutters, and once this is dried a bit, then I'll go through and separate the two before we do any painting. But this is just a much easier way to create the shutters in one piece before we kind of go through and separate them out. So I've just used a bit of craft glue there and just spread it out with my finger just to try and even out the glue across the two pieces. Here we go. So yeah, so let's cut them in two, so that we've got, so that as we go through and paint them, we can actually paint those the side pieces as well, just to make sure that, because if we painted them up while they were still here, like together, when we cut them apart, you'd have that raw cardboard and paper edge that you just have to go through and paint anyway. So yeah, I just thought that this was a much easier way to do it. Now from here, the actual cardboard itself is quite It's quite thin. And I was debating what to do here, so I've actually gone through and created a layer of Mod Podge. You don't actually have to do this, but I just felt that it would kind of glue basically it all together. So I kind of go over just with a thin coat of Mod Podge and then try and get through to every single blade. And actually, in hindsight, this was probably the best way to go about doing it, because when I go back and have a play with each of the blades, it means that they are able to stick against each other before we kind of get into painting and we start losing a whole lot because they're not well secured. It is only just cardboard and they are literally hanging on by a millimetre each side of one of those blades. So yeah, so I just go through and give them one coat of Mod Podge just to try and kind of stick them all together. Here we go, and then grabbing the tweezers again just to go through and just tweak out some of those bores, because as we've kind of flattened them down to cut them and then painted it with Mod Podge, they've kind of flattened out a little bit. So what we're wanting to do now is really just kind of just go over the whole lot again and just tweak them up a little bit, pull out some, just make them look a little bit more run down and broken is what I was looking for. That was the word I was looking for. A little bit more broken. So yeah. Sorry, it's a little bit off camera. Clearly I was, because they're so small, I'm obviously trying to get them a bit closer to where I can see them, closer to my face, closer to where I can see them, so never mind. And yeah, so just kind of working your way through those and just opening them up a little bit more. And I do both of those, which is quite good. So there you can actually see quite clearly it's a lot more open, and just with a little bit more, a couple there more that are broken. Definitely on this one there's a lot more that are broken, and I actually am able to pull out a few as well. So yeah, and then once this sort of dries, I let this dry for quite a bit and before we start painting it. So by the time we get to painting, we don't go through this whole exercise again, because we've already gone through this and pulled it out. So the Mod Podge actually helps kind of lock it all into place, which is a good thing. So there you go, just pulled off one, because I knew that there were a couple more around here that were sort of a bit loose, which is absolutely fine. So yeah, it's just kind of working your way through it, just tweaking it, working out what looks good, what can you play around with without it trying to be too uniform. I think that's the hardest thing with these things, is trying to make it look random, and trying not to make it look too uniform. And I think sometimes the more that you think about it, the more you overthink it. So yeah, it's looking pretty good. And here I am just tweaking it up a bit more. Just trying to kind of get them to match as closely as possible. But yeah, there we go. Time for some paint. So I'm just using that same brown that we used on the inside. This is the warmer colour, so it's actually, because what I wanted to do was create a bit of contrast with the shutters and the black roof. So making sure that it wasn't too dark, but also wanting to make sure that it looked aged. So this is we'll just do one coat of the brown across all of the shutters, trying to get in between them all. I do both sides, although I don't think I've got the video of them both, don't need to really see them both sides. And just doing around the edges. So this was the whole point of cutting them apart to begin with before we started painting, is just making sure we get all those edges. Oh, there we go. There's the back of it. So I do 2 coats on the back at the top, because the very, very top piece is, you will see that from the overhang as it's opened on because of the angle of the roof. And so that will, I just want to make sure that we don't see any blue Weet-Bix sign coming through from the other side, and just making sure that we've got a good coverage. I'm not too worried about too many coats on the front side because we're actually going to go over with some watered down black paint as well. So I'm just creating a wash here with the black and just creating some weathered look. So it's just a quick wash over the two, just to kind of create a bit more of a wash. One thing I will do, which I haven't done in this video, is I will go over with just a really, really light dusting of white. What that does is, as you could see when we did it with the wooden interiors, it just helps pick up some of those details, and I haven't quite done that yet, but I'll do that after we put more of the project together. So here we go, we're going to put the shutters onto the outside of the project, and I'm just using some 450 glue. It's kind of like a Fabri-Tac glue. It's kind of like, somebody mentioned it the other day, it was like cold hot glue. I know that sounds a little bit backwards, but it's great. It really adheres quite quickly. It's like a gel, so it's quite sticky, and it's a great way to get something onto your project really quickly. So there we go. It is all done and dusted. Okay, so that's the end of the project. So hopefully you've learnt a few different techniques, and maybe you'll do things differently to me, learnt from my mistakes along the way, and learnt some tips and tricks around how to create some shutters, different tools, different materials and tools, and all those sorts of things that you can use that might be local to you, that you can actually use for your project as well. So stay tuned. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for the next lot of videos that are coming through for the Addams family. So there's, as you can see, there's still lots to do.